So hello everybody. This topic is called Democratization of Art, Reflection of on Justice. Today we will have several panelists. Actually, the previous plan was that we should have 5 of them, but unfortunately Anna Rastas is not with us due to health reasons. So we will have a little bit more time to discuss actually at the end, and also you can be more feel more comfortable about your time. Actually, you will have like a 15 till 20 minutes to present your research or paper or whatever. And our panelists today are Kuba Szreder, Annelies van Assche, Alina Juverovic, and Tatiana Romashko. Our first lecturer is Kuba Szreder. He's a PhD and a lecturer at the Department of Art Theory at the Academy of Fine Art in Warsaw. And he had a really huge research into the art theory and sociology. Too, also he had an independent curatorial practice. He did a lot of interdisciplinary projects that are dealing with artistic and organizational experiments, hybridizing art with other domain of life, etc. Also, he published several books, and I met Kuba in Norway several years ago. I don't know if you remember. At one very interesting workshop where he presented his paper about authorship, but today he will present something else. He will talk about working disruptions, revisiting the contradiction of the global networks of contemporary art in the moment of their forced suspension. And he will be actually focused on these issues of unpaid labor of art workers that is exploited to sustain a rapid succession of artistic projects, and also about ideological contradiction of contemporary art world as such, to say like this. And what is important, I think, that Kuba will also at the end present some different models that are based on the self-help and self-organized collective that have a kind of capacity to secure art workers' survival. So Kuba, stage is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thank you very much for the invite. I'm happy to contribute. Such a shame that we would be so cool to meet you all in Belgrade. Well, but here we are, dispersed through the electronic networks. The piece I'm going to present is actually slightly, I mean, it's precisely on the same topic. But as Danilo just said, but actually it is more of a sloganeering piece because the visual backbone, in terms of maybe to start it, the presentation is based on my already developed critique that Danilo just also introduced of the political economy of the global networks of contemporary art. Currently, I'm working on a book called ABC of Projectariat, the English version of this. I have published a book under similar title in Polish a couple of years ago. So it does discuss global networks of contemporary art from the perspective of art workers, or so-called projectarians, means people who actually work on the projects. And I adjust this critique currently to the realities of COVID-19 pandemic, discussing social engines based on velocity and ultra-fast turnover of projects in the moment of the forced suspension. But the visual backbone of my presentation is based on a piece. I hope that you see it now, my shared screen. Is it visible? Cool. It is based on a sloganeering piece that I developed for the space Room 46 in Aarhus, Denmark. It is an artist-run collective that celebrated its 25th anniversary this year. The piece was called The Affairs, or it is called The Affairs of Artwork in the Age of COVID-19, in a couple of bullets and points. And I wanted to express my sincerest gratitude, especially to Grete Agard, who kindly helped me with his designs. What I also need to say that I wrote this presentation. I typically try not to do it, but as the timing was so tight, and I could speak a lot about every of these particular slogans that I'm going to present here, I decided to actually write it down. The presentation, maybe it's worth mentioning, is based also in this ethos of self-organization and cooperation. As I said, it is a response to the generous invite by an artist run space, and it's also kind of developed together in our discussion, and then this co-designed, so to say, with Greta. And just a couple of words of introduction to the theses and slogans presented below. In my opinion, or maybe this is a general framework, in my opinion, the disruption caused by the global pandemic unearths the underlying tensions of the global circulation of contemporary art, revealing its self-contradictory, exploitative, and inherently unstable character. Structural conflicts specific to artistic networks are typically glossed over by the accelerated multiplication of biennales and other events. Thus, our current forced disruption can be used as an opportunity to analyze what Gregory Cholet termed as a bare art world. Its inherent tensions that are based on the overarching conflict, and here's my kind of general thesis of political economy, so to say, that the overarching conflict shaping these networks is based on a tension between the artwork and people who amass cultural capitals or accumulate them. This conflict, it is my opinion, has to be analyzed from the wormhole perspective of precarious art workers. And this mapping should not be a mere description of the political economy of the global networks, but rather its structural critique aimed at modeling possible alternatives beneficial for the 99% of art workers rather than 1% of art stars. And here this notion of a critique of political economy, I owe it obviously to Marx, but then on the other hand also to Vladan Jeremic, who organized this very meeting with which we participated a couple of years ago with Danilo, and who actually, after my presentation, sensibly remarked that what I presented down there was rather a description of economy, while we shall talk about its critique, means also finding alternatives or kind of like overcoming the conflicts that shape it. And yet, I will investigate these structural contradictions not only by using kind of like Marxist perspective, but rather a Marxist perspective that is adopted and transformed by feminist economists such as J.K. Gibson Graham, who highlight the otherwise obfuscated realm of social reproduction, and also have a slightly different vision of how this how general economy functions. I will conclude by proposing that in the moment of structural crisis, the art worker's survival depends on the community economies of contemporary art structured as the interdependent networks of public institutions, NGOs, unions, movements, self-organized collectives, informal self-groups, and individuals. But I will just suggest it, I will not develop this thought, hope to make it in the discussion. So the pandemic proved that the ideological contradiction between aspirational, motivational character of the artwork and its intrinsic precarity is fundamental to networks of contemporary art, because the underpaid labor of art workers is exploited to sustain a rapid succession of artistic projects. And art workers are motivated by visions of future rewards that seemingly justify their current sacrifices. The crisis only unearths the ideological character of this conviction, because there is no future return on your current precarity. Since the beginning of crisis, we were exposed to the visions of life under quarantine, imagined as some sort of idling existence in perfect households. But the reality for most of art workers is totally different. They live in cramped houses turned into offices and lecture theaters. This fate shared with many other people from middle and working classes struck by the crisis. Only the rich have enough money to take it easy. The caring classes are too busy taking care of their family's household, dwindling incomes, depressed students, distressed friends, and impoverished comrades. Projects are fun only as long as one can afford to chase them. The disruption of COVID-19 only amplifies the general precarity of freelancing. One of the main distinctions magnified by the crisis is whether somebody has a stable job or can be sacked at will by the line managers or project administrators. Crisis struck people on temporary contracts the hardest. Educators, curators, artists suffered most when the projects and assignments are so easy to be cancelled. And once again, if somebody can afford to live without projects or with temporary jobs, have savings, is an owner-occupier, can count on family support or even family funds, it is not a big deal for them. Otherwise, the pandemic becomes an existential crisis. The crisis proves an ideological character of meritocracy, as in order to stay afloat, one needs not only talent and hard work, but rather a safety net of inherited privilege to rely on in the times of need. Artistic networks are founded on the ideology of self-reliant individualism. Everybody is for themselves their own capitals and fields of investment, while in fact, entrepreneurialism of the self is a winner-take-all sport that privileges the already privileged. Its end result, a pseudo-meritocracy of inherited wealth. This neoliberal self-entrepreneurship is inherently parasitic. It mobilizes people to partake in frenetic exchanges that sustain the velocity of the global networks of contemporary art. This model aims at accumulating social, cultural, and economic capitals at the top of artistic hierarchies that are generated at the expense of artistic labor and more generally cultural commons. The accumulation of these capitals is structurally analogical to the role of debt in overall economy, as the owners of capital do not even need to hire anyone to capture the fruits of their labor. For the disfranchised many, career in art is as profitable as a microcredit, a lot of work, but not a lot of returns. The systemic suspension of circulation means more, not less, work. When opportunities are scarce, art workers have to run twice the distance to reach them. One of the misconceptions regarding the nature of contemporary networks is that they are constituted by projects, while in fact, networks are run on what happens in the gap that yawns when one project ends and before others begin. This vacuum is filled with frenetic activity aimed at securing opportunities. As in the world of flows, only an unimpeded access to the flow of opportunities provides a semblance of stability. Because there is always more people than opportunities to be chased, projectarians become competitive opportunists by default rather than conviction. As they have to run after one temporary opportunity after another and many in the same time. At the end of the day, every man is for himself and one network is set against them all. Freelancing is like chasing your own tail. The more you run, the closer you get to your own back. The question is, how long can you run in vicious cycles? Till you reach 40, till you have kids, till you have to take care of your parents, till you finally need a weekend or a time off. There is no rest for the wicked, neither there is any rest for the mobile and creative. Even the pandemic is a moment of zoomification, the one through which we are going now, of a flurry of e-communication. The art market is as dispatched from the lived reality of art workers as financial markets are from the real economy. From the wormhole perspective of an art worker, art market is a real abstraction. I would not say it is simply irrelevant, because it somehow represents the cultural wealth generated in the global networks of contemporary art. It is also not sheerly speculative, as prices are anchored in values and values are generated by labor. However, this labor is as dispersed and distributed as laboring multitudes are. Thus, the values are siphoned rather than directly appropriated. An art market seems to be this golden city floating aloof over the horizon of everyday toil, undisturbed by the harsh realities of the crisis. In this sense, the art market is as dispatched from the lived reality of art workers as financial markets are distanced from the real economy. But in fact, both markets are rooted in the reality of everyday toil. The beneficiaries simply manage to shape the reality to their own benefit. These are art workers who have to bear the brand of crisis. Most of corporate museums simply close the daily operations, offloading the cost by mass layoffs of educators, handlers, and service personnel. The crisis told us, though, that the rank and file of art workers are first to be laid off when masterism is interrupted. This is even more absurd as the prices of commercial art skyrocket when the rich are showered with taxpayers' money. The top tiers, at least top tiers of art market, because it's different in different tiers of the market, definitely, have not suffered major losses for simple reason that its fate is closely intertwined with the fortunes of the billionaires, whose wealth is shored up at public expense by eventually by ordinary people who back up state debts with their own wages and who maintain the economy while the rich enjoy the free rides. Everyday Heroes was the exhibition mounted by the South Bank Centre in London in the same time when this cultural megacomplex laid off many of its core workers. It was, I think, April, May, or like maybe April, June this year. And in the same period, just a couple of hundred meters away at the Bank of Thames, a group of radical art workers and trade unionists organized strike at Tate Modern, demanding reductions of layoffs and better conditions of forced redundancies, and ensuring the right to return. It is striking, though, how much everyday heroism is required for maintenance of these institutions, and yet how unrewarded it is in the times of crisis. In the same time, when stocks are shored up by public money and corporate museums saved from the failings of their own unsustainable business models, art workers are told to tighten their belts. The board members are reversely generous. They give to their own and take from the others. Bulging on free lunches, they preside over mass layoffs. This is the solidarity of the rich against misery of the poor. In response to the crisis, art workers unionize and self-organize in solidarity with other workers in this franchise. They are all in it together. They are all in it together. In Poland, at the onset of the crisis, unions and associations of art workers actively advocated for shaping the support packages in order to support workers rather than banks or just enterprises. This discussion is still ongoing, and it's not going actually particularly well. Partially, they succeeded, as the municipalities, institutions, and the ministry provided some support eventually. Even more importantly, unions supported art workers by organizing strikes, petitions, support groups, and solidarity actions, but thwarted the competitive logic of self-entrepreneurialism. And in contrast to corporate museums, some artistic institutions like Trafo Gallery in Szczecin, like Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, like Labyrinth Gallery in Lublin, acted in solidarity, respecting the workers, supporting artistic communities, providing stipends, and finding other means to distribute help. So it was a pretty typical thing that instead of organizing a large exhibition that would be otherwise anyway inaccessible, a large public institution, or at least those that reinvent themselves as institutions of the common, tried to provide stipends to as many artists as they were able to. Like this was what was done by the Museum of Modern Art or by the Biennale, Warsaw Biennale. Art created in these independent networks is so much more than what is served on the art market. It unfurls on the streets like a rainbow flag that covered public monuments in Warsaw, as jubilant as a multitude that toppled the statues of slave masters, as resistant as art workers striking in Minsk, as courageous as young women amongst the many artists, curators, and educators who are currently struggling against the oppressive authoritarian government in Poland. And I think that this is also a very interesting development of the current situation. That on the one hand, we see this general crisis of the artistic networks. On the other, a lot of these clusters of or like bottom-up or self-organized or more critical clusters of artistic networks are being mobilized in order to support like a lot of different struggles worldwide, from Black Lives Matter ending up in feminist strikes that currently rock Poland. And just to summarize it all, interdependence matters, and another art world is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kuba. Our next panelist is Annelies van Assche from Ghent University, where she teaches studies in performing arts and media. She's a doctoral degree actually, and she is dealing a lot with dancing precarity. And the topic of her text is a contemporary dance world and the thin line between self-realization and self-precarization. In this text, she will deal with with the similar topics that Kuba actually pop up with about precarity, but more focused on performing artists, and try to problematize the project funding system related to the dance. So, Alice, go on.
Okay, I'll try and share my PowerPoint. Do you see the entire presentation now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. Also, Kuba, I'm very excited that I can present after you, because you'll see a lot of things resonate with what you just talked about. In 2014, between 2014 and 2018, I conducted quantitative as well as qualitative research in the contemporary dance scene, specifically in the capitals Brussels, where I'm from, and Berlin. And I approached my research both as a dance scholar and a sociologist by focusing on the artist's experience of the particular working conditions in the scene, in the art world, and the working processes, art as work, and the influence of these on the dance productions that we see on stage, so the artwork. So although I specifically inquired into contemporary dance, I think the majority of the findings of my research, which have recently been published in a book, that they actually apply to a general larger segment of the performing artists, especially the ones who work autonomously on a project basis and are therefore not affiliated to one particular institution, or even to any type of worker who performs immaterial labor, basically. So I prefer to speak of autonomously working artists rather than independent, because the vast majority remains dependent on a variety of institutions, ranging from funding bodies over to production houses and theater venues. So differently put, a career in the performing arts actually entails or develops between institutions rather than within one, and the competences and requirements to uphold such an inter-organizational career, they drift between independent and dependent work. And that's really interesting because it is already reflected in the fact or in the employment status that the profession holds in Belgium and Berlin. In Brussels, in Belgium, performing artists, freelance performing artists are actually employees, and in Berlin they are self-employed, which is, I think, the case in most European countries. So in Europe, performing artists, not unlike many other cultural workers, they're typically hopping from one project to another, juggling temporary contracts topped up with hours of unpaid labor. This is not very new. What I tried to do is to explore how this socioeconomic precarity is micromanaged by agents, by performing artists, specifically contemporary dance artists. However, since I didn't have a lot of time to really go into all of the findings of my 4-year research, I chose to single out a few of the 86 steps from the ironic handbook, How to Become the Ideal Cultural Worker, which was published in the Masca Journal in 2016 by the authors here mentioned on the slide. I'm sorry for not repeating their names, but I would probably horribly mispronounce them. But this was a text that I'm referring to, a text that was actually part of a performance that premiered in 2012 in the Co-Festival in Ljubljana. And it was a handbook, How to Become the Ideal Cultural Worker in 86 Steps. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm gonna just reflect on some of these steps and try to show how the line between self-realization, one of the core values in art making, but also in life itself, and self-precarization is actually very, very thin. So I'm just going to repeat 3 steps. 23, be always ready to sacrifice. 24, never sacrifice one working opportunity for another. You can always do both. 31, be always ready to work for free as well. It is better to work for free than not to work at all. So these steps reminded me of self-precarization, which is a notion that was coined by Isabelle Lauré in 2006. And it was also a very prevalent phenomenon among the dance artists in my field work. Because they, and this may account actually for many creative professions, they seem to be willing to sacrifice material income for the sake of immaterial income, such as autonomy, the intrinsic pleasures coming with being creative, opportunities for self-development and self-realization, self-actualization, and so on. So the desire to grow and to express the self and to realize one's full potentials seems to be at the core of a willingness to work unpaid or underpaid. Several of my informants were, for example, very happy to work together underpaid because they just wanted to explore the potential of the collaboration that promises to provide immaterial income. So aside from governmental socioeconomic precarization, there is also such a thing as self-precarization. 61, when you are not working on a specific project, get ready for the next one. Read, watch, listen, talk, discuss, network, meet, discuss, network, read, watch, read, listen, network, meet, discuss, network. 62. Never go home after a show or a film, even if you have a deadline hanging over you. Use the opportunity to meet, network, discuss, network, talk, listen, network. Even when you don't know the people, get to know them. You can never know too many people. 63, be always ready to network. 64, socialize. So despite many of the differences between Brussels and Berlin on the macro level in terms of social security and so on, I came to the conclusion that both capitals actually share a very similar symbolic economy, which is powered by a social productive system in which artists follow the logic of what I call the bohemian work ethic, a work ethic that acutely affects the performing artist's art, labor, and life. So in both locations, the queried artists were occupied with a threefold chase, as I called it. 1, after direct and indirect funding. 2, after gatekeepers that provide access to rehearsing infrastructure, presentation venues, and so on and so forth. And 3, after paperwork, which was mostly related to the mobile and autonomous work environment. So mostly they were preoccupied with accumulating economic, social, and symbolic capital in order to be able to work. So in doing so, they have developed a quite comparable habitus in Brussels and Berlin, in which life and work depend on one another, which is much in line with neoliberal ideology. However, what's important is that this entrepreneurial logic that is adhered to is not entirely and exclusively defined by neoliberal individualization, because there is also a very significant sociality associated with it in generating these relationships through which networks are constituted, maintained, and expanded. So the study has actually thought is that the most successful autonomously working performing artists have learned to ensure their employability by operating in accordance with this at once individualized and social ideology. So they deploy neoliberal capitalism's exploitative demands to their advantage. And in this context, my research has shown that contemporary dance artists are increasingly finding innovative ways or tactics to secure their future, to join forces, to share knowledge and thought, and to share practices of collaboration and self-organization. So like in the 86 steps in the handbook, most of these tactics were actually survival tactics. But also, like in the 86 steps in the handbook, they were mostly tactics of individual resilience. So although the steps in the handbook were written down by a collective of artists, in the end, they're very individualized steps. And similarly, within my research, I've also only witnessed a few collective tactics that could actually be subversive and that could actually lead to structural change. And this is in part so because the unfair and precarious working conditions that contemporary dance artists specifically deal with are tied in with a more general pointed issue affecting our society and late capitalism at large, which is the neoliberal imperative to always do more. So since the responsibility, and this we heard this morning also in the keynote, since the responsibility lies on the shoulder of neoliberal and post-Fordist worker herself, the power to do less, as Bojana Kunst calls for, and the power to say no to unfair conditions is rooted in the collective. Today, there's certainly an urgency, a readiness amongst artists to confront the problem of precarity, as testify myriads of debates, but also performances that really specifically deal with this topic. But saying no collectively is extremely challenging in my field, because many artists are still willing to work despite of the precarious conditions. At least within my fieldwork, self-precarization, for example, is widespread. So never say no to a project or a temporary work assignment. Never say no to work. Never say no, says the handbook. So as a consequence of never saying no and constantly, like also Kuba said, chasing your own tail, the quality of the artist's life, but also the quality of the artistic process and eventually the product decline. So subsequently, the immaterial compensations like recognition and artistic pleasure and intrinsic motivations like self-development of the artists fade away. So more and more burnouts, they surface in the field, a field that is in fact structurally precarious and in which precarity has a plural character. And in fact, there seems to be a broader dynamic at work, which is reflected in these steps. 26, always do one more thing than you can do. 27, when you are super busy and you think you can't possibly do one more thing, except one more project or work assignment. 28, always do one more thing than you can do. 29, always do one more thing. 30, always do more. So these words actually tie in with the connection between employability on the one hand and potentiality on the other hand. In a study on practices of employability within UK universities, the researchers Kostea, Amaridis, and Crump argued that due to the principle of potentiality at heart of the recruitment of ideal future workers, and the project-based worker is always a future worker, there actually exists an ethos of work that de-recognizes human limits. It makes false promises of absolute freedom and thus becomes a tragic proposition from the individual. So in relation to the notion of employability, one's potentiality as a principle represents the human subject as capable of always becoming more than what one is, on the one hand, and work as a process of freeing up, liberating and mobilizing the subject's inner qualities, always ready to be actualized, on the other hand. So the authors underline that the danger lies in the fact that work is seen as a place for the actualization of one's potentialities. So if every individual ought to see themselves as always capable of more, then one is actually predetermined, and I quote, to engage in a tragic self-seeking journey always bound up with a looming prospect of failure to meet such expectations, end quote. So exactly this seems to be at the core of a feeling of constant insufficiency. One of my informants testifies in a very short quote, "I'm doing my best, but it's not enough somehow." According to sociologist Ulrich Bröckling, this feeling of insufficiency, for that matter, epitomizes the entrepreneurial self and is chronic. He puts it as follows. He says the constant fear of not having done the right thing or not enough of it, the feeling of insufficiency, is as much part of the entrepreneurial self as mercantile skill or the courage to take risks. So in my fieldwork, also the need to feel productive recurs throughout the whole fieldwork, and it becomes a coping tool to self-justify the validity of one's work. The pressure among my informants to optimize their productivity and potential was very high, However, the many unrewarded work efforts, be it materially or immaterially unrewarded, they bring about this feeling of insufficiency that may lead to stress, anxiety, exhaustion, and eventually maybe burnout and depression. So insufficiency ties in with potentiality and employability and constitutes the thread that interweaves self-exploitation and self-realization. Continue. 20, be at people's disposal as long as you still appear to be busy. If you do not appear to be busy, you will not be busy. 21, always appear to be busy. 38, be always ready to learn whatever. 39, be always ready to learn. 40, be always ready. 54, be always ready. 60, be always ready. 79, do not plan to have children. Do not plan to have a husband, wife, regular partner. Do not plan to have a dog, cat, iguana, goldfish. Do not plan to go on holiday. Do not plan to get ill. As such, project-based cultural workers, who are also always future workers, are not only confronted with insecure prospects, but also with this constant feeling of insufficiency. And therefore, they may come to combat burnouts or even depressions because they wear themselves out constantly chasing, like in the GIF here, chasing your own tail. This is also shown in my fieldwork. 5 out of my 14 longitudinal informants have addressed the topic of burnout spontaneously, and they have expressed explicitly that they have either suffered a burnout in the past or they were on the verge of one during the period of my fieldwork. However, some informants noted that it was actually very difficult to acknowledge this mental health situation because, as an informant also put it, you only technically have a burnout when you go to a doctor and they can prescribe you not to go to work. But that's not very relevant unless you have a full-time job. So if that seems to be the case, then a burning question remains, which is how long do contemporary dance artists, or cultural workers for that matter, endure this situation, and why do they continue exercising that profession? So I speculate, it's just a speculation, that when the exchange rates between immaterial and material currencies becomes weaker, there might probably be an exit from the profession. But I also predict that artists generally remain loyal to the profession as long as the values that drive contemporary dance artists compensate the plural forms of precarity. Nevertheless, I think that a time has come that they're raising their voices, and their voices are becoming much louder each time. And most importantly, they're becoming increasingly collective. As for example, in these steps, 80, always reflect upon your labor performance. Be critical, be merciless, be ambitious, demand the impossible. 81, always reflect. 82, always reflect upon the social political situation surrounding you and your labor performance. 83, always reflect. 84, always reflect upon the social political situation surrounding you and your own position within it and your labor performance. 85, always reflect. So on a more collective level, tactics of sharing practices, exchanging means, and self-organization could possibly offer more structural forms of protection, while well aware that this actually precisely ties in with neoliberal ideology. So as such, rather than individually trying to resist exploitative demands of neoliberal capitalism, artists may collectively opt to deploy these to their advantage instead of letting them exploit themselves. So many of the queried dance artists imagined systems of solidarity where one dance artist's gain, such as, for instance, receiving funding, would facilitate the work of others too. For example, one informant explicitly mentioned imagining a sort of emergency fund that would be generated by every dance artist who received project funding and who would donate a share to an emergency fund for those that did not manage to receive funding for their current projects. And similar ideas about pension funds that way are imagined as well. But practically, in the context of creating a sharing economy, I came across one particularly interesting platform, which was the open source platform for lateral exchange, initiated under the name Nobody's Business. And the format was really interesting because it consists of the self-organization of week-long sessions for sharing dance practices and knowledge about dance within local dance communities on several occasions. So sessions have taken place in Brussels and Berlin, but also in other locations for a couple of years now. And the initiatives, in doing so, they support each other and the general development of the performing arts field through fostering the proliferation of information, common knowledge, information outside of the economies of dance workshops, dance classes, and creation of dance productions. In their mission statement, they write, "Nobody's business is nobody's," as a deliberate negation of the individualism that contemporary neoliberal and hyper-capitalist economic realities impose upon our lives. So basically, it's kind of a counter initiative to reduce the costs that go accompanied actually with learning dance techniques, learning dance movement, because dance is a lifelong learning process. So in line with most of these commoning practices, participation in these week-long sessions is free and is open access. And the initiators actually even imagined granting the participants a fee for joining. However, this is not much the case. They managed to get funding to organize these weeks, which covers the expenses, but fees are not in question yet, hopefully in the future. But this particular commoning initiative, as I call it, has actually successfully set up an alternative exchange system for dance knowledge in favor of solidarity and collective care. And in the future, the initiators hope to expand this sort of format for across other arts disciplines as well. But that's very unfortunate, my research has not uncovered many such collective tactics and commoning practices. And that basically seems to confirm the predominance of individual trajectories and a certain lack of community, which is generated by the project-based funding system that copies basically neoliberalism's competitive model. So therefore, I was very happy that yesterday and today to learn really about more and more examples of such practices, and I'm really looking forward to learning more. So thank you for listening to this presentation.
Thank you, Annelies. This was a really exciting presentation, and I really extremely enjoyed. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah.
And our next panelist is Alina Juverovic. Lina is a curator and a lecturer at Art Policy and Management at Birkbeck College, University of London. And her research focuses on the ways in which the sphere of contemporary art can become a site of solidarity and community building. She realized a lot of projects, curatorial projects, and published a lot of texts. And also she deals with the Eastern European art scene a lot. She was involved in the organization of Sanja Iveković and Irving exhibitions. And she also was a curator of the 5th Nordic Biennial of Contemporary Art. So today she will present us her research that is called Nice But Not Essential, Rethinking Value in the Work of Small Visual Art Organization from the Decolonial Perspective. And in this paper, she will focus on the question of value in cultural work, but not in the monetary terms, but examining which aspect of cultural work we currently value and which aspects have been overlooked or sidelined under neoliberal pressures. So, Lina, go on.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? Yep,
Yes.
Great, thank you. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay,
and
brilliant.
Also I have something just to add. If anyone have any kind of comment or any kind of question, please put it in the comments so we will at the end have, I think, time to discuss. So Lina, go on.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to take part in this amazing conference. I've enjoyed it so much so far, everything that I've heard. Of course, I'm delighted to see many friends and acquaintances here, but of course it would have been even better to be all hanging out together in Belgrade. but unfortunately not this time, hopefully soon. So my talk today concerns small visual arts organizations in London and questions of how their work is valued. I ask what agency they can have in imagining and creating alternatives towards another art world. In my talk, which you could say is autoethnographic, I will use the experience of founding and running for some years, together with my colleague Irene Revel, such an arts organization called Electra. I also draw on the work of the research and advocacy network called Common Practice, which is a network of London-based small visual arts organizations, which was founded in 2009, and Electra was one of its founders. But the issues addressed, I'm certain, will be recognized by those involved in running grassroots DIY organizations in many locations. So I will start by explaining the title of this presentation, nice but not essential. As I speak, the PowerPoint will show some of Electra's projects, and hopefully this is happening. Okay. So they will show some of Electra's projects, and you can think of this as the visible public side of the organization, while what I'm saying is the sort of behind the scenes of Electra's work. So it very much parallels the kind of presentational side of things as we sort of present our organizations and our work sort of to the outside versus what's actually happening, the labor and the events sort of in making all these things happen. So Electra's work during the time I worked there mostly focused on commissioning art projects in collaboration with museums, galleries, festivals, and involved a slow and careful process of developing projects with artists and various partners. We very much saw ourselves as part of the London's art ecology alongside other small contemporary visual arts organizations. And it is in this context, one of small visual arts organizations that I am speaking about today. So Electra was an Arts Council NPO, National Portfolio Organization, for about a decade. And this means that we were part of Arts Council's portfolio of funded organizations. The funding covered our office costs, overhead, salaries, and a little bit of funding for research, travel, and other expenses. If you remember, if any of you were present at yesterday's keynote presentation by Victoria D. Alexander, you will remember her slide explaining the UK funding structure, which was very clear and excellently presented. So you could think of this as kind of zooming in at that sort of middle point where Arts Council funded organizations meet the funders. So that kind of relationship. And you can think of this presentation as a sort of zooming in or a voice on the ground, having heard her presentation sort of laying out the broader context. So the title of this paper comes from a conversation with our Arts Council officer at that time, who during a client liaison meeting, as they were called, I believe, in trying to explain how Electra's outputs needed to be more in line with what the Arts Council, as its main funder, expected and needed, and how we needed to differentiate ourselves from other similar organizations, she told us that our work was nice, but not essential. And whilst this was not a welcome statement, obviously, we could also, of course, see what the officer meant from the point of view of the funder. Our projects were eclectic. Each was different from the last one. There was no dependable rhythm to them, no pattern. They took a long time to produce and develop, taking and allowing personal life events into account and allowing such events to slow down the project. Our insistence on working on our terms, only developing projects that could be fully funded and equitable, with all parties fully paid for the work that they did, meant that we could actually produce very few projects. And needless to say, the excess labor was fully absorbed by us in the organization. The projects were often process-based and discursive, to such an extent that they were difficult to articulate in a straightforward marketing language necessary to justify our regular funding status and underline the division between audiences and producers. They often blurred the inside and outside, so to speak, in crude terms. So our slippery projects, their long gestation periods and artist conversations were actually what we at Electra valued most and wanted to nurture without ambitions for more, faster, or bigger. The communities we built around our projects were and continue to be what I would see as our biggest asset, but this way of working was simultaneously our biggest challenge and probably downfall in terms of Arts Council funding, because the values underpinning our funding contract and the metrics applied were above all placed at the service of the creation of financial value. What I mean more specifically, and there are 7 points here. Sustainability and longevity were equated with growth. We, like other funded organizations, were subjected to what in one of the common practice reports has been termed the tyranny of measurement. The metrics of audience figures and external funding were applied across the broad across the board to large and small organizations, disadvantaging those with scarce resources. That was 2. 3, diversity and inclusion were equated with expansion of both audience, range of partners, as well as the artists' the range that we worked with. And yet, we'd hoped to go deeper rather than broader. 4, we faced the expectation of a certain discovery drive, and I'll return to this later, to find new artists and reach uncharted territories. As a small arts organization, you're sort of expected to be on the ground discovering, sort of constantly bringing in new artists, new things. 5, we faced the linear view of artists' careers where they would somehow pass through the phase of working with small organizations like us and graduate to something else, something bigger and better. Same was the case for curators. 6, the implicit agreement to feed the market. However, indirectly, that may have been happening. So commissions that we were making happen would eventually make their way to freeze and make their way to sales and make their way into collections and all of this. 7, attachment to exclusivity and the perpetuation of the myth of scarcity, if you think of the term flooding the market. So the kind of adding to these narratives. So none of this was of any interest to us. Instead, we were gravitating towards a slow and steady in-depth work with artists and partners and the slow, ever deepening community of support and various alliances being forged within that, based on shared values, not specific projects. So here I ask, what in the work of small visual arts organizations like Electra is essential as opposed to nice? And I can't help but wonder if when we try to rethink our values, may we actually want to focus on the nice and forget the essential. So much work has been done on the question of value, amongst others, in the aforementioned Common Practice Network. The advocacy of the Common Practice Network identified the concept of deferred value, whereby, and I quote from Sarah Thelwell, whereby the value created by an initiating organization is realized long after a commission has moved beyond its jurisdiction. So this is Sarah Thelwell in the report called Size Matters. She explained, and I quote again, intuition tells us that there is a difference between the ways in which large and small organizations commission new work, negotiate relationships with artists, develop critical dialogue and formats for discussion and display. However, when pushed to express this difference in concrete and measurable terms, we struggle to reach a point at which both small and large organizations can agree on the different roles they play within the ecosystem. As such, the implicit consensus on the value delivered by small organizations is often at odds with government and funders' standard measurements, which tend to rely on audience figures and diversification of funding as the main indicators of performance. So this advocacy work continues today as well, with reports by Carla Cruz and Rebecca Gordon-Nesbitt, who in a follow-up report highlighted some 10 or so points to aid the funders in better understanding and valuing the work of small visual arts organizations. Now, advocacy and lobbying, the work done by Common Practice and others, argues that value needs to shift from outputs to labor and processes, something that we also heard about yesterday. And while I strongly believe that this work is important, I would argue that such shifts can only happen and are only possible as part of a much more radical and foundational re-evaluation of what arts organizations are, what they're there for, what they're there to do in the first place. This shift in metrics cannot occur unless we ask more fundamental questions about the arts field or ecology or complex, whatever you want to call it. So this next part is titled "The Non-Conformist Cultural Worker as the Colonized." Here, I want to argue that we can think of the non-conformist cultural worker, one that challenges and resists the metrics outlined above, as being colonized by a dominant hegemonic value system which erases, silences, and disables. Our values, language, processes, relations, and communities have been taken over, possessed, and there is a need to reclaim them. The way we ascribe value and the way we then go on to measure it can only begin to shift if we destabilize the underpinning principles that have become naturalized within the cultural industrial infrastructure that dominates our work and our pleasure. And here I'm referencing Andrea Phillips, the scholar and artist Andrea Phillips, who uses this terminology in, again, one of the Common Practice papers. She talks about the cultural worker, and I quote, as exhausted, overworked, and politically drained because they're constantly performing the contradiction. On the one hand, competing with their peers, proving to funders that their audience numbers are high and their sponsorship letters are out, while simultaneously engaging in intricate political and conceptual discussions with artists whose work directly and indirectly challenges such a culture. This double game of speaking two languages that I think we're all very familiar with. Firstly, we need to acknowledge and locate the colonial logic of the way the system works by continuing to discover, shed light, bring into visibility artworks, artists with a focus on youth, the emerging artist as a form of investment plan, so to speak. We are underlining and perpetuating this logic. The current turn to research-led exhibitions and links with the higher educational institutions is in some ways a positive move, but then what do we do with this research? There's a deeply colonial undertone to the need and desire to take something out of communities and display and present it somewhere else and make it available through acquisitions. The Indigenous education scholar, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, has written about the deeply traumatic connotations of the term research that it has on Indigenous populations. She states, research is a dirty word in the Indigenous vocabulary. The way scientific research is then implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism is a powerful reminder for many colonized peoples. And the colonial origin, end of quote. The colonial origins of research are embedded within the Western discourse about the other, which is supported by institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, doctrines, even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. And this is a reference to Edward Said. So a decolonial program would need to challenge the very terms of the conversation, not slightly adjust the terminology of the conversation. When we talk about delinking from the colonial matrix of power, which is a formulation introduced by Anibal Quijano in the 1990s, we're talking about delinking from the logics and fundamental hierarchies and structures of that our organizations rest upon. Walter Mignolo reminds us that there is no ontological reality, such as modernity or tradition. Modernity and tradition are both Western and modern concepts by means of which West and modernity become the very definition of the enunciation that invented tradition and the Orient. Decoloniality, therefore, requires an epistemic reconstitution of ways of thinking, languages, ways of life and being in the world that the rhetoric of modernity disavowed and the logic of coloniality implements. End quote. So it is necessary to step outside of existing frameworks and existing logics and engage in a deep undoing of not only our structures and institutions, but thought and sensation to be able to rethink our subject positions. So what do I mean by this? To return to the question of what is nice and what is essential, some questions that for me are important to think about in relation to value. Why is it, for example, why is it that the written word is acknowledged as more valuable and trustworthy by our research institutions and arts institutions than word of mouth and oral histories? Is embodied knowledge about our organizations and their histories worth anything, or are individuals seen as dispensable? Rather than measuring the success of commissioning, just to take one example, we may want to ask what commissioning is and why commission in the first place. This is a question about publics and about audiences, which I'm glad came up in yesterday's discussions, the questions of inside and outside. And another question within that is, does that even exist in the current landscape when we're all online and things are much more porous and even in some ways? Can we focus on the quality and longevity of relationships we build as cultural workers, shifting the focus away from outputs? Is it possible to value social reproduction work as weaving in and out of our cultural work? When we look after each other's children or meet in each other's homes over a meal to discuss the project we might be working on? Is solidarity, collegiality, ethical work seen as important, or is value in the neoliberal art arena solely attached to public visibility and high-profile cultural outputs? So in conclusion, I think that the current crisis, challenging and revealing as it has been, as we've heard in the previous presentation, it has also shown us that alternatives are possible and that this may be a moment to do this work, this decolonial undoing. But we do need to shed certain attachment to the idea of a linear career progression, attachment to success in the mainstream world, attachment to CVs, oeuvres, portfolios, competition, prizes. We see encouraging examples. For example, powerful messages have been coming from artists for some time now. The Turner Prize last year, whereby a group of artists formed a collective and refused to accept one winner. This year, just now, also the German award, where the same thing happened. The way we see that mutual aid sprung up so quickly, once, I forgot to move the slides, once the pandemic started, the project Artist Support Pledge, which is a project of artists mutually supporting each other through sales via Instagram, which was mentioned yesterday, and a certain equalizing of platforms now that much of cultural work has migrated online. To conclude, in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, Tuhiwai Smith proposes 25 indigenous projects as, and I quote, a way of the survival of peoples, cultures, and languages, the struggle to become self-determining, the need to take back control of our destinies. These 25 propositions or projects are presented as 25 actions and include claiming, testimonies, storytelling, celebrating survival, remembering, indigenizing, intervening, revitalizing, connecting, reading, writing, etc. So as much as this may seem like a broad and abstract proposition, I believe that it is precisely the small arts organizations that are in the best position to do similar, multifaceted and polyvocal work, perhaps under the radar, perhaps not yet fully articulated as such, with a view to decolonizing and reclaiming and dreaming up another art world. Thank you. And I will just finish going through these. And these are just the sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. Our next panelist is Tiana Romashko. She's a grant researcher and a PhD candidate in the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. And she's also a senior researcher. She was, I'm sorry, a senior researcher at the various universities of St. Petersburg in Russia, and she was teaching the master program of cultural policy at the same university. And her research interests encompass Russian politics, cultural policy studies, cross-border cooperation between Finland and Russia, cultural governance, and the post-cultural discourse theory. Her recent research project is devoted to the development of the state cultural policy in Soviet Russia. And the talk that she will give us today is called A Flight Over St. Petersburg Street, Russian Authorities Against Popular Culture and Contemporary Visual Arts. And there she addresses the political conditions of Russia cultural policy development after 2012, when the policy became a part of conservative project proposed by Putin government, and art is become a highly regulated sphere somehow. So Tatiana, welcome.
Thank you so much for your introduction. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm glad to be here. Frankly, I can see that my presentation is a bit out of the context of the general discussion, but let's see how it goes. So today I'm going to first provide briefly the context of Russian culture policy development, the recent transformation of Russian culture policy development, and I will explain the theoretical and methodological basis of my research, and then I will lay out the case study of street art in St. Petersburg in order to explain the main characteristics of the Kremlin-driven culture policy and its possible consequences for the Russian creative industries or cultural sector and cultural economy. So here we go. This is the context. Presidential elections in 2012 and the following mass protest against Putin's government sparkled a conservative shift in official thinking. Kremlin's political project has established itself against aspects of westernization, liberalization, and individualization, which it regards as the threats to authority and control. Hence, it mobilized culture sphere as a part of a political regime. In doing so, culture policy was formulated as a civilizational mission that aims to make the people out of the mere population. And within this context, Russian state culture policy became a part of a conservative political project. And changes occurred both at the symbolic level and in the normative dimension. A range of restrictive legislation and strategic papers related to sovereignty, culture policy, national identity, and the Russian language established new forms of power relations between the state and the cultural sector. My research methodology draws on the post-structural discourse theory and derived from works of Michel Foucault, Stuart Hall, Ernest Laclau, and Chantal Mouffe. This approach treats discourse as a system of representation where meanings and meaningful practices are produced within the rules and norms of a specific historical formation. Normalization of rules is understood as a moment of cultural hegemony. It is a certain way of seeing the world and a specific way of being in this world. Hegemony assumes that norms, behavioral patterns, and social practices are not questioned, or it is hard to challenge them because of the resistance of the common sense to critical thinking, seeing, or practicing traditional things in a different ways. As Foucault says, discourse is implicated in the process by which human beings are made subjects. Post-foundational political scholarship defines subject positions as a temporary location of the specific identity within discursive formation. Important point here is that some formations of discourse are dominant and some are marginal. And the question is about the ontological source of power that might be considered responsible for maintaining the domination of one discursive formation and marginalization of the other. For instance, Laclau and Moos suggest seeing the political articulations together with moral and intellectual leadership as decisive for establishing cultural hegemony. In other words, hegemonic discourse formations provide the rules of what might be said, done, or thought by whom and where. It sets up specific social, cultural, and political properties of discourse and its rules of domination. So this piece of research is based on a discourse analysis of the latest political debates around the new legislation on culture in Russian Federation and subversive activities of popular culture in St. Petersburg. All images presented further in my presentation were taken from the Telegram channel Protest St. Petersburg and online journal The Paper. So the conservative project attempts to re-articulate the concept of culture and value within the nodal points of the Russian civilizationism. Russian civilizationism as a concept highly recognized by the mainstream academic discourse and the Russian quasi-discipline culturology. This way, culture is fixed as conservative through the discourses of traditional values, qualitative man or qualitative person, spiritual patriotism, and orthodox morality. In fact, culturology advocates cultural essentialism that is constructed by antagonism to European-driven liberalism and individualism. It proposes a social mission of culture as a policy priority to first combat the Western decadence and the second to improve the quality of the Russian people. Therefore, I claim in this presentation that the conservative project constructs a new agenda in Russian culture policy, which opposes the value against the creativeness or freedom of self-expression. Thus, Russian hegemonic discourse as a system of representation articulates value versus creativity and draws new lines of inclusion and exclusion. In culture and art, it entails a change of attitudes and perceptions, as well as change of institutions and practices. On the one hand, there is a rapid rise of censorship and increasing intolerance to modern arts in many Russian cities. On the other hand, there is a boost of grassroots creativity, counterculture, and culture economy as an implication of those. So let's go to the case study. Case study of banning street arts in the city of St. Petersburg and its possible interpretations. So the case study. On the slides, you can see masterpieces of street art made by the art project Hoodgraf. The essential idea of this project is to make the livelihood more closer to people who live there, the residents, and their ideas, their sorrows, feelings, and so on. This graffiti celebrates the spirit of local community and people's heroes. Graffiti sites became places of visit, leisure, and hobby. Moreover, they attract tourists, promote local community, and become a part of a local economy. In other words, grassroots creativity works both as a civil representation and a cultural asset, which through consumption, mediation, and reproduction turn into a form of capital. On this slide, you can see the beloved leaders of the rock bands. Some of them are still alive, some of them passed away, and those places basically used places of commemoration of those people in St. Petersburg. Also, this art project uses images of beloved cinema heroes. For instance, Danilo Bagrov, played by Sergei Bodrov in the Russian film Brother, and Vasily Zadov, played by Dmitry Nagiev from the TV series Caution Zadov. So the thing is that all these images were continuously destroyed. So as you can see, this picture of Viktor Tsoi was destroyed multiple times in several, like in 3 years. The picture of Mikhail Gorshkov also 3 times, and Yuri Shevchuk also about 2 times. So this, in other words, like this grassroots creativity works attracts money, attracts public attention, and supported by the people. But at the same time, the local municipalities try to destroy it. So while the most of the UK and the EU culture policy put the stress on social and economic implications of creativity, emphasizing positive outcomes for community fostering, city brand building, and creative economy, the city government of St. Petersburg takes a very different approach to culture policy and civil participation in this. Even though these sites of graffiti art are significant and dear to residents and the tourists of the city, the local authorities persistently destroy the masterpieces. Usually the graffiti, as you can see, are removed, the high quality graffiti are removed by the municipality authorities because of the anonymous complaints, but quite often, as we can see on this slide, ugly scripts and drawings are left untouched just behind them. So this is another artworks. Also, they were destroyed by the municipality authorities, as you can see. So on the one hand, these images hardly might be qualified as patriotic or spiritually enlightening or described by other key words of the official culture policy doctrine. It is because the meaning and the spirit they convey are associated with the lowbrow consumerist popular culture or even counterculture, like here. Because all these leaders of the rock band, they were singing and celebrating the times of change or the spirit of the change in Russian political sphere. So, and it is because the meaning and spirit that they convey are associated with like the lowbrow, consumerist and counterculture. But there is no a clear example how grassroots creativity and its subject positions get into the loop of disqualification from what might be considered as art, true culture, contribution to the city development, social inclusion, and marketization of cultural diversity. So there is no legal subject position for creative class in official discourse. This is the first point or result of research. Instead, This identity is deprived of rights for cultural expression, freedom of speech, and public activity. Through the antagonistic discourse of power, which marginalizes constructed positions of foreign agents, non-patriots, dissent, traitors, gay, representatives of opposition, and counterculture. On the other hand, these graffiti do not convey ideas of extremism, racism, or radical nationalism, which is against the Russian laws. So basically, there is no legal basis to remove the picture from the abandoned walls or electricity substances, but it still repeatedly occurs that they are destroyed. In this case, the Russian common sense appears here as a conservative reproduction of the official line, which is resistant to fresh ideas and practices of neoliberalism. Just to conclude, the key point which I wanted to stress here is that if the city of St. Petersburg wants to attract capitals, investments, tourists, it has to at some point to rethink the policy in relation to cultural diversity and civil participation in the city brand building. So, well, this is the reference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tatiana. And we have like 7 more minutes, maybe for some questions. I would also like to say that I don't think your talk is a kind of different from the others, especially because I think we need to understand that there are really different contexts in which artists are working and dealing, especially about when we talk about artists that don't have this kind of big official institutional support, and that they are all dealing with a really different problem. Still, we don't live really in one world, even if we think that this pandemic situation especially brought us like kind of more together into that sense of exchanging the information about what is going on, and bringing the visibilities of some structures and art organizations that are actually working but are not really present always. And we have, I think, one question that I would like to first pose. It's a question from Milica Lapčević. She asked Lina, who do you believe should redefine the value and impact of the small art organization in order to enable a variety of approaches?
Yes, thank you. Who should redefine them? I think it's a process. I think that if we use this approach, that's the kind of the same metrics for all, it simply doesn't work because the work is so varied. So I don't think it's so much the question of who. I think it's more the question of the different agents within the cultural field working together to think through the different roles that organizations and artists and practitioners hold within the broad spectrum of what arts and culture do produce and offer. And I think it's the case of developing a set of, perhaps a kind of a spectrum or a selection of different possibilities that organizations can work with, because I think this singular model is really impossible for small organizations. It's applying rules, it's trying to do something that you simply don't do, and failing at it. So I think it's much more, but I do think, I really genuinely believe that this deeper undoing or deeper questioning of what organizations are there for, this whole idea of here we are running around doing this work behind the scenes, and then we present this perfect seamless product that then goes on to be presented elsewhere and acquires cultural value. I think that's problematic. I think the boundaries between the public and the sort of behind the scenes are almost now redundant, especially now with the pandemic, where, you know, the channel that, I don't know, something like MoMA or Tate would use are the same channel that you're using from home or I'm using from home. So I think we really need to allow ourselves to let that happen rather than attach to all the kind of rules that are already out of date. I don't know if that answers it. It probably doesn't.
Thank you. And we have one more question and 2 more minutes. Question for Tatiana. It seems that low quality tag graffiti is allowed because it is essentially meaningless and therefore not a threat to the hegemonic powers. Can you say the same for abstract art now in Russia? Is it allowed, since I can't articulate concrete threats for the regime?
Thank you for these questions. Actually, I didn't include in my presentation the abstract works by Kandinsky, which were performed by different street artists in St. Petersburg. And yes, they also were demolished by the local authorities. And I guess it's not because of this like some sense which is seen as a threat, because no one understands the scripts, graffiti scripts on the walls in Russia. And no one from the FSO or Federal Service of Security investigates this case. But the thing is that this is just an antagonism between this kind of bottom-up cultural creativity, which tries to pay its way through the appearing at the city walls to the world of economic prosperity, because like Hoodgraph and all other graffiti artists, they make quite a lot of money like from their projects. They go to the US, to Bali, and they sell their skills, they sell their ideas, so they are quite successful in an economic way. But the thing is that the idea in Russia, like the official idea propagated in Russian culture policy nowadays, that you have to ask permission from the local authorities whether your ideas are good to sell or not. And this is how it happens, like at the common level, when St. Petersburg residents, whether they are old people, they think that, so they want to make money on our walls, like they want to self-promote themselves, so we won't allow this. And this is how the antagonism and struggle occurs like for the last 5 years. But thank you for the question.
And Tatiana, is there any graffiti in Russia that are allowed? If you can just very, very short say in a few seconds.
Yeah, sorry, I also didn't include this point into my presentation, just to save the time. Well, there was a legislation adopted by the city of St. Petersburg and by the Russian government, the Moscow one. The thing is that any graffiti will have a chance to be allowed if it is patriotic or true patriotic, if it has educational meaning in itself, or it promotes spiritual values of Russia, basically Russian Orthodox Church. In this way, of course, some places will be given to the artists to perform in this way, but not many artists want to do this.
Yes, thank you. And we have one more question, and it will be the last one for Lina. And please, Lina, be like a very short, like 1 or 2 minutes, because we are already out of time. Like it's a question from Anya Obradovic. She said, you mentioned nurturing the art market. Do you believe in the possible sustainable collaboration between small art organizations and commercial art galleries, perhaps in supporting artistic projects and developing educational programs, talks, etc.?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think that this happens a lot already, and we see a lot of these collaborations and partnerships. I think it's possible, and I think it does, it can work, but I think it very much depends on each organization and its mission and its ethos and its raison d'etre. Why is the organization there? I think ultimately, I personally, in relation to Electra, would have some concerns, and I would always feel that somehow I'm again servicing the kind of bourgeois corner of the art market. I feel very sort of sensitive about these matters, and I think if engaging, and we have, I mean, we've taken part in art fairs, we've collaborated a lot with different commercial galleries as well, but at the end of the day, I personally believe that as publicly funded small arts organizations, you end up the loser. And we can talk about that in many, many ways, not now because we're running out of time, but it's a super interesting question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Lina, and thank you everybody for taking part in this panel. And in 15 minutes, we will continue with another. And stay with us today till the end of the day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.